All right. Hi, Caitlin, are you there? Yes, there you are. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about
Good.
you?
I'm doing good. I'm super excited to talk about the death of Jane Lawrence with you today. It was one of my favorite books this year. You already know how obsessed I was with The Luminous Dead. Like, I recommend it to everyone I know. It kept me up all night. And Jane Lawrence was no different. It was amazing. So thank you for this gift.
Thanks for the praise.
So yeah, just to briefly introduce myself and you, Caitlin, I'm Victoria Lee. I'm the author of the books The Fever King and the Electric Air, as well as A Lesson in Vengeance, which came out this August. For Caitlin, I'm just going to read your bio, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Caitlin Starling is a nationally best-selling author of The Death of Jane Lawrence, as well as the Bram Stoker-nominated and LOHF award-winning The Luminous Dead from 2019. Her other works of genre-hopping horror and speculative fiction include Yellow Jessamine and a novella in the Vampire the Masquerade Connection, Walk Among Us. Her nonfiction has appeared in Nightmare, Uncanny, and Nightfire. Caitlin also works in narrative design and has been paid to invent body parts. She's always on the lookout for new ways to inflict insomnia. First off, what do you mean invent body parts? I feel like I need clarification on this one.
It's a very long story, but essentially I was the narrative designer for a immersive theater experience in New York called A Human, which was a body modification store. And we worked with a bunch of really cool special effects artists to make it happen, but I got to help come up with all of the designs and then write all the copy for them, which influenced the final look of them all. But yeah, so like we did cool things like neck frills and other just on the borderline between really, really pretty and really, really freaky fake body modifications.
That sounds so cool. I used to work at like Bodies Exhibition, one of those cadaver museums. So this is up my alley and also very on brand for somebody who would write a book like Jane Lawrence. So I approve. For everyone who's joining us today, thank you for coming, and also just make sure throughout that you can drop all of your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have 15 minutes at the end of the session to get to all of your questions and try to answer as many as we can. So as we're going, feel free to talk to each other in the chat, but also to put any of your questions in that box. Okay, so I'm going to dive in because, like I said, this book just kept me up at night.
Do we want to do a reading first?
Yeah, let's do the reading.
Yeah, just to get everyone in the mood. Before I start, a couple things. Most importantly, this discussion will potentially get into spoilers at some point. I'm going to do my best before my answers get into that territory to flag it for you all in case you are in the middle of the book or you haven't gotten a chance to start it yet. But we might touch on some of the later plot events or concepts in the book. Along with that, this reading that I'm going to do for you guys, it's going to be about 5 minutes. It is chapter 12. For those of you who have not gotten that far yet, the only things you need to know is that Jane has arranged a marriage for herself with the local young doctor, Augustine Lawrence, who has a house outside of town, Lindridge Hall, which he has made her promise that she will never visit. On her wedding night, events out of her control forced her to stay the night there, and she has now been there for a couple days. Some weird stuff has happened, but nothing concrete. And Augustine has at last returned to visit her. They had a moment of intimacy right before this chapter starts, and that is where we're going to launch off from. All right. Sleep came, but did not remain for long. Sometime after midnight, rain drumming on the windows of Augustine's room, Jane rose and pulled on her nightgown. She'd woken up overheated by her husband's body in the narrow confines of the bed. He had been right. It was not built for two. And yet she could not help but feel pleased at the stiffness of her limbs. She looked down at him, wondering a moment longer. He had wanted her, and she had wanted him in return, and it had been miraculously simple past a certain point. Buttoning her housecoat by touch, she shuffled across the bedroom floor until she reached the door to the hallway. With one last glance at the bed, she slipped out of the room, then felt for the knob mounted on the wall that would bring up the gas lighting. The study couch had been good enough for him, and so it would serve for her. But though the couch proved comfortable, the hearth was cold, and the shadows cast by the skulls and other oddities unsettled her too much to sleep. She left the study behind and climbed up to the third floor instead, her mathematical treatise and Augustine's monograph clutched to her chest. The library hadn't been piped for gas lighting, likely due to the arching glass ceiling, but a candelabra was set on a small table by the door. She took it, lighting it from one of the sconces in the hall. Inside the library, the air was still thick and musty, but no longer unpleasant, and the room was warm despite the ceaseless drum of rain on the glass above, courtesy of a fire Mrs. Pearl had built that day to help dry the room out. The sitting room would have been a more comfortable spot, perhaps, but she did not intend to sleep now, only to read long enough to exhaust her mind so that she could return to bed, worn out enough to slumber once more. Mrs. Pearl had freshly polished the long table in the center of the room, and chairs now sat around it, clean and handsome. Jane set the candelabra down, the library's green liquid light folded around her, bathing her like water. After a moment's thought, she set aside the monograph for the daylight. Instead, she opened to the first page of her mathematical philosophies. The writing was dense, the type small, and deciphering the logic took up the whole of her attention within minutes. Her only regret was that she hadn't brought her pen to make notes in the margins, but sliding her finger along the text worked almost as well. As she read, the rain came down harder, the sound echoing across the high-ceilinged room. The book sketched out the possibilities of seemingly impossible mathematics derived from the division of 0. 0 did not function the same as 1 or 2 or 20. It erased or expanded beyond the bounds of reality. And so, this text argued, one could use 0 to take the volume of a rounded barrel without needing to fill it and measure the contents in a more standard container after. One could find the area below a theoretical curve, calculating smaller and smaller regular areas below it into infinite nothingness. One could find the answers that must exist, but that no Breltanian scholar had ever been able to reach with exactitude. Magic. It sounded like magic. Reaching the end of the second chapter, Jane paused to rub her eyes. Tendrils of sleep were beginning to tug at her shoulders, but she knew herself. If she went back down now, she'd just be wide awake again after a few minutes. Still, the words were starting to dance before her eyes. Sighing, she looked up and gazed out the darkened windows. Something was there. Her breath caught and she stared, willing the shadow to resolve. Augustine, she called, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Her pulse racing, she rose from her chair and picked up the candelabra. Whatever it was moved. As it turned its head, she made out a fall of golden hair, not her own, for she was perfectly still. And then she saw the terrible red eyes. She fell back a step, a cry beginning to build in her throat. The empty shelves surrounding her seemed to grow in size, to loom and pen her in. Elodie. No, it wasn't Elodie, couldn't be Elodie, and yet who else could it be? She pinched at her fingertips as if that would dispel the illusion, but Elodie remained. Her features were indistinct, her face seeming to warp and blur around those red eyes, but her gaze stayed fixed on Jane. She had to get to Augustine, had to get somewhere safe where she could realize what an anxious fool she was being. It took all her willpower, but at last she tore her eyes from the ghostly figure to look toward the well-lit hallway. She took one step, then stopped, a half-formed cry leaking from her mouth. Shapes moved against the far wall. There were 3 of them, and they were tall, taller than any man. They had elongated heads, downturned, shallow crescents. In the gas lighting, those crescents looked like some kind of headdress, with the wearers veiled and robed beneath them, almost hiding their strange proportions. But she could see. She could see how their shoulders sloped unnaturally, how long their limbs were as one lifted what might have been a hand. From the headdress, there was an unbroken line curving out to the shoulders, masking any hint of face or throat. All 3 turned toward her. She staggered back into one of the shelves, breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her hands were shaking, the wax from the candelabra splattering and stinging her bare feet. The flames guttered as she sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as if that would offer any protection. One of the figures in the doorway turned toward the windows, and Jane helplessly followed its gaze back to Elodie. But Elodie was gone, and the 3 figures were static only a moment more before proceeding down the hall, toward the stairs, toward Augustine.
So that was amazing. It's always so interesting to hear people read their own books out loud and like see where they put the pauses and the emphasis. Obviously incredible. And I hope that anyone who hasn't bought the book yet is now inspired to pick it up. So yeah, I'm not sure where to start even. I guess I'll say, since we were talking about Lindridge Hall and how, you know, it's mysterious and she wasn't supposed to stay there, and then now she's ended up spending several days there as of the point of the excerpt that you just read. What was your, like, was there any inspiration from any place that you've been before for Lindridge Hall, or was this just completely a fabrication of your imagination?
It is largely the latter, except part of it, especially the library that I just referenced, came from this one recurring dream I had about 5 or 7 years ago, where I would be creeping around on like the top of the bookshelves in a glass-walled and ceilinged conservatory of some kind. Not so much conservatory, not in the sense of having plants in it, but usually in my mind, actually, it had a very, very long dining table, and it was always raining. And so when I was trying to come up with a very visually evocative space for this very strange part of the house, that is what came to mind, and I decided to play with it.
That's very creepy. I love it. I feel like the book in general did have like a lot of gothic themes in it, like echoes of like Rebecca and Crimson Peak and other gothic media. So I was wondering, what were your inspirations for the book and for the characters?
I started writing what would become The Death of Jane Lawrence immediately after seeing Crimson Peak in theaters. So I think literally it was within a couple days that I wrote the first maybe 3 or 4 chapters, and then ended up, it sat for a while, and I came back to it a year later or so. But yeah, I had just come out of Crimson Peak, and I had grown up, loving Jane Eyre and Beauty and the Beast and Phantom of the Opera, which I would argue also count as gothic romances or gothic horror. And Crimson Peak sort of brought all of that back out of my past. And I was like, oh, I've never really thought about writing something like that, but I bet I could. And, but there were a couple of things that I knew I wanted to push and play with. I, for one thing, wanted the questionable love interest and potentially dangerous love interest to have a redemption arc of sorts that led to him not just phoning in the final solution to the book, like showing up at the last minute to help out, but actually like working with the protagonist for a decent part of the book. If you finish the book, you know that that's not exactly how it turned out. But at the time when I was first writing it, that was the role I envisioned for Augustine. And I also, at the time, was working as a bookkeeper. And so Jane came out of what I was doing in my life at the time. And I wanted a protagonist who would make interesting choices, would make slightly different choices, but still kind of end up in the same place. She chooses to get married, and she picks the person she marries very carefully. She's not seduced into it, like in terms of Rebecca. She isn't, she isn't trying to save a family member. There's financial considerations that trap her into needing a marriage, but the specific marriage that she picks seems like it should be within her control. And so unraveling her feelings of control was a lot more interesting to me than just kind of dumping her in over her head and watching her flail.
That's actually the perfect lead into another question that I personally really want to get your take on, which is just about like the feminist themes in the book. So like it is like this trope that we've seen in other media, like you mentioned Rebecca and Crimson Peak, like the trope of a woman newly married to a wealthy man who's dangerous, right? Like he offers her freedom from in a patriarchal classist society, but then he turns out to kind of be a threat in his own right. But you kind of turn the trope on its head a little bit in that Augustine and Jane really do have this powerful connection that develops throughout the book, even as he still represents a lot of danger to her. And so I was wondering how you saw that relationship echoing the relationship between men and women more broadly in the time period, or just why you chose to go that particular direction with the relationship.
So in the initial draft or two, I followed Gothic tropes a little bit, perhaps too closely, in the sense that Jane kept forgiving Augustine for things and being willing to sacrifice and take on burdens for him out of love. And I had a couple early readers very intelligently go, this makes me really hate Augustine. And also go, Jane, what are you doing? You're smarter than that. And so over iterations of the book, there was this push-pull of how much does Jane not put up with his danger and jerking her around over various things and his lies and betrayals. How much does she put up with that versus how much does she remove herself from the situation and call him out on things? And I've gone to both extremes. And I think I finally settled on one where I wanted them both to be kind of or Jane at least to be aware of the forces pushing on her. She's aware that she is trapped by societal and economic forces. She is trying to work within that framework, and she is very upfront about that in a lot of ways. And Augustine gets all of that. He understands all of that from the beginning. She's very clear from the very first chapter, this marriage is a business arrangement because otherwise I cannot be independent. And he goes, cool, I'm fine with that. it's just that both of their own personal things start getting in the way in terms of how they were raised, how, what has happened to their life up until that point, because Augustine is in his 30s, Jane is in her early 20s. They both are bringing kind of ghosts into the conversation even before we get to any potentially literal ghosts, in terms of how previous relationships have played out with family, with potentially previous spouses, to touch on another Gothic trope. But yeah, a lot of it, I think it got more interesting the more personal I let it get, and the more messy I let it get. And so I just sort of every iterative draft, I just got a little bit closer to that. I let both of them take actions that don't necessarily fit the Gothic mold, but again, bring them back into that familiar plot line.
Love it. It's done very effectively. It's one of my favorite iterations of that trope and of that kind of romantic subplot that you see in Gothic books. So another one of my favorite things, though, was the flaws of the characters and how you kept those in focus throughout the entire book. And you use those flaws to build the story and to create conflict. So it was like the characters and their mistakes driving so much of the plot and so much of the scary stuff that happened as well. And so I was wondering how you went about deciding what Jane and Augustine's flaws were and how those helped you develop and progress the plot.
So my rule of thumb when I create characters is that their greatest strength should also be their greatest weakness, at various points and for different reasons. So Jane is from the very beginning marked by her not only desire, but her ability to control her surroundings. She is very analytical. She is willing to put aside emotion to get what she wants, and not in like a scary way, but in just a very methodical way. And so her flaws had to come from that same place, and some of those are obvious. She comes across other characters as very cold or very withdrawn, but also it devolves in some ways, in very big ways, into obsession. Because if she's so certain she can control the outcome of a thing, she never stops to ask, well, should I do that? Just if she can have control, and she should be able to have control, then she's going to have control. And that really does not pay off sometimes. This is a small spoiler moment, but just because I feel like it really is an exemplar of that where that comes in, is when Jane goes, you know what? I think it is the most reasonable option to inject myself with cocaine right now. That's not going to cause problems at all. And of course, that spirals off into its own issues. Whereas Augustine, his greatest strength is his compassion, especially compared to other doctors that Jane meets in the book. He's very humanist in his approach. He is very patient first. He is deeply affected by the patients that he loses. And that also is his greatest weakness, because he can't let that go. And he blames himself for things that he probably shouldn't, and gets into cycles of behavior where his own martyrdom essentially is hurting him and everyone around him. And that's one of my favorite scenes in the book, is when Augustine lays out what he thinks is an entirely reasonable series of events and choices that he made, and the reasoning behind it. And Jane looks at him and goes, can you hear yourself talk right now? like how do you think that every patient you have ever lost is your fault? That's ridiculous. That would mean that you're all powerful. Are you all powerful? And he's like, well, no. And they have this back and forth over that, which again has to do with a sense of control and responsibility. They both together have these extreme feelings of being responsible for everything around them, and that they should be able to control everything around them.
On the subject of flaws, one of the questions that was in the back of the book, one of the book club questions, which, since this is the Barnes & Noble book club event, I feel like is relevant to ask, is that shame and obligation are constant themes for both Jane and Augustine. So which of their actions do you, as the author, feel like were mistakes and worthy of being shamed, and which should they not be ashamed of?
This, of course, will probably get into spoiler territory. Personally, I forgive them for most everything that they do. I think that's just because I wrote it. But if I had to pick some that stand out to me as highly questionable, this comes up, I think, in another one of the discussion questions, and this is big spoiler territory. At the end of the book, Jane realizes that she's done something to Augustine, and then she does not ever tell him what it was. And I know, like, obviously, not only did I decide for her to do that, I also know why that is the correct decision from her perspective. But, and at the time when I wrote it, I also thought that it was a perfectly normal thing to write and perfectly fine. And then my editor looked at me and went, "This is horrific." So that one probably is the biggest question mark over Jane's head. Also, her accepting the responsibility of the patient that she's called on to care for in Augustine's absence. There's a young boy with scarlet fever that she's tasked with taking care of. And in some ways she's forced into doing it, but I do think she probably should have said, this is not something that I can ethically do. And she should have removed herself from the situation. For Augustine, the biggest thing is definitely his repeated decision to lie and to not give Jane or other people involved all the information of what's going on in his life. In particular, the fallout from a previous relationship of his has estranged him from his own parents. And the book doesn't go into the details of that, but it is implied that it's largely because of a breakdown in communication that happened afterwards. And while, of course, as the writer, I understand why Augustine decided to not tell Jane about his life. And he actually had no obligation to do so, because the way they had structured their contractual marriage was that it really should not have ever come up. Past a certain point, he should have told her, and perhaps, not told her that she, spoiler alert, dreamed the entirety of chapter 12 that I just read to you. That's probably, I think, the worst thing that he does, where he actively says, he dismisses all of it when he knows that she has the memory of what happened and says, "Oh, no, you must have had a nightmare. Now I'm leaving, goodbye." And then he leaves the house and leaves her to deal with that alone.
That was definitely the moment where I was the most pissed off at Augustine as well. I was just like, really? We're really, yeah. Oh, okay, we're doing that. Cool. Yeah. Also on the Augustine subject, another one of the book club questions is, did the problems at Lindridge Hall come from Augustine's actions, or did they come from his beliefs about himself and others?
My opinion is that it is the latter primarily. However, I like leaving it up to readers, because the way in particular that magic works in this world is both very sharply delineated and also really muddy at the same time. The magic system gets into issues of, it goes beyond belief into what we might term as delusional thinking, but is not delusional because it does have results in the real world. It echoes into the real world. And so a lot of the push and pull of who's responsible for what's real and what isn't real comes down to how much you believe the characters have agency in their own world versus how much things are happening outside of their intent. Things that are accidental things or things that they could have stopped but didn't stop. And it's that line again of, okay, well, where actually is their level of personal responsibility? Because the magic, as Jane understands it, actually puts that as the burden quite firmly on the magician. Mm-hmm. Which of course aligns with her own personal views of herself and her own capability. So it could go either way.
Again, I just feel like it comes back to how character driven the book is and how so much of it is kind of guided by their individual flaws and their mistakes. Another thing that I love personally about your writing that really came to the fore both in Jane and in your previous book, The Luminous Dead, is the way you have of making the reader feel like they're in a fever dream. So the reader's just along for the ride and you can't stop turning pages because you're lost in the story. And as a reader, you feel like you're losing your own sanity right alongside the characters. So how did you go about creating this sense of just slowly losing your mind and this unease in the reader?
Some of it is sort of reflexive on my part. It's just sort of how stories emerge in my brain. But on the more conscious side and technical side, a lot of that is by staying very tightly in limited third person, staying very close to the character and sort of accepting as the narrator anything that my characters are seeing or perceiving. Like I prefer not to sort of lampshade and point out like, here's Jane having what might be a hallucination. Jane has the experience and then later may reflect on that experience in a way that gives us some idea that perhaps what we perceived as the reader and as Jane is not reality. And there's in particular, going back to that spoilery bit about Jane administering a dose of cocaine to herself, there's no moment in which either authors say, and then Jane was on cocaine and she was high and she was making bad decisions. I just let her make the bad decisions. And in her mind, they're not bad decisions. So you ride out that period with her and the writing, the text gets a little bit more amped up, a little bit faster, a little bit more disjointed, but not too much, just a little bit. And then afterwards, you know, you surface from that chapter and you go, well, wait a second, what just happened right there? And I, weirdly enough, I don't think I could do it as well if I had, say, written this in first person. I think part of it is that the close third person makes it feel like you're just a step behind them. So you feel like you have some level of objectivity, but of course you don't, because I controlled the words that went on the page that you just read. Same thing in The Luminous Dead. You get just this little bit of, you know, you assume you can trust what's on the page. And you can, like, I'm not actively trying to hide things. I don't like doing that. I feel like it can feel cheap or frustrating to, you know, as readers when we find out we've been, you know, actively lied to over the course of a book, that certain things have been left out intentionally and there was no hope of us ever figuring that out until the end. I don't like doing that, but I do like playing with perceived objectivity versus what I'm actually letting you know about and what I'm focusing your attention on in a scene.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that anyone in the audience who's an aspiring author themselves appreciates kind of hearing the technical aspects to it as well. So I also just really want to know, on the note of how scary the book is, did you ever scare yourself writing it? Because I definitely wanted to sleep with the lights on afterward. Or were you just too aware of the mechanics of it to actually scare yourself?
There were a couple scenes that made me sort of amped up while I was writing them. Mostly though, the risk was in imagining future scenes, like when I was going to bed at night. Because then there wasn't the action of writing to sort of keep my brain occupied. It was just the images unspooling. And some of those images would get pretty freaky at times. And half the time I would be like, oh, that's so cool. And I'd go write down the idea before I lost it. And then the other half of the time I'd just be lying in bed going, why did I just think about that? There was a long time of me like locking my bedroom door while I was working on it.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
And the other thing is I didn't ever write it like after dark. That probably helped. I think if I had been trying to write the scenes like when the sun had gone down, that might have gotten a lot freakier.
Yeah, definitely not a book to read or write with your back to an open door or with a single candle flickering on your desk.
Yeah.
So the setting of the novel is really similar to our own world, or to a historical period in our own world, with some key differences. So how did you develop the world for Jane? Like, what did you choose to change versus keep the same? And how did that play into the Gothic atmosphere you built?
So I had a whole lot of things that sort of joined, that all went into the pot that ended up becoming this world. So I'm trying to decide where to start. Part of it was in terms of recent social history. I early on knew that I wanted Jane to be a survivor of a recent conflict. And that I didn't want her to necessarily have lived like in a contested border area. And and I knew I wanted there to be like chemical warfare going on, sort of like World War I gas attacks, but that all happened in trench warfare. Little tiny 5-year-old Jane was not going to be in a trench somewhere. So, okay, it can't be World War I. So now we're looking at World War II with the Blitz in London. Fantastic, no chemical weapons. So, okay, we're already gonna have to mash those up together. But I didn't want medicine to be 1940s level. I wanted it to be Victorian, well, late Victorian. So, okay, now we're pulling back to the late 1800s, but we're going to have chemical weapons and we're going to have not airplanes, but the ability for a a city to be shelled, at least from the ocean. And then you throw in the math, and the math that Jane is dealing with reached Western Europe in about the 1600s. Sir Isaac Newton was involved, and for those of you who don't know, he was actually an alchemist. He wrote extensively about it. And there is a historical connection between calculus and concepts of magic. But that's the 1600s, and I'm definitely not going that far back. Okay, so now I have to somehow figure out, is it feasible to have a late Victorian technological society that doesn't know calculus? Turns out it is. You can't do it. And then on top of that, I wanted, I still needed Jane to have societal pressures that required her to get married, but I also wanted there to be women doctors, which no one really questions. So there's already going to be a slightly different social hierarchy situation going on. And in fact, in this world, there's a little tidbit in there that women doctors came out of undertakers, and undertakers are mostly women in this world, and they used to be nuns. So you have that through line up to modern doctors like Georgiana Hunt and Abducha Nizamiev. And I also wanted this world to be a world without an active state religion, because it becomes like, I didn't want Jane to be able to run to the priest. I think it's a lot scarier to have to run to a supposedly objective judicial figure to solve an issue like this, because that leads into all sorts of questions about how trustworthy women are perceived, and in terms of, hysteria and mental illness and all sorts of things. So I put all these things together in a pot, and out comes a world that on the surface immediately sort of feels like Victorian England because of the technology, because of the fashion, because of the social situation, but slowly unfurls to be a little bit more complicated than that. And there's also, finally, when it comes to ritual magic, it has unfortunately a really questionable racist history that is absolutely something that is to be explored, should be explored in books, but is not something that I could explore. So part of it was selfish in terms of wanting to give myself a fictional background, a way to craft a ritual magic system that has a different origin point, which largely would only really come up if there was a second book, perhaps, that went into some of the metaphysical history of the world, which is not technically a thing, but it could be a thing.
It could be a thing.
Should be a thing,
perhaps. No, but I really do think that was one of the things that contributed so much to that unease and to like the atmosphere of the book, was you kept trying to anchor yourself on like a time period and be like, oh, okay, I figured it out. It's like 1893. And then you're like, wait, but no, the math isn't right. And then so you're constantly slightly adrift. And I felt like that was incredibly well done.
Yeah.
So I think I want to try and get to some of the questions from the Q&A. So if you have questions, again, please throw them into the Q&A box. That's where I'm going to be looking to get questions to ask for the last 10 or 15 minutes. So, okay. Somebody also, by the way, Judy just said that your explanation of deciding on the setting and the time period was fascinating, and I completely agree. So let's see. Laura says, to me, Jane reads as neurodivergent, which is a really interesting choice for a Gothic influenced book. Was that intentional?
Combo yes and no, in that when I first started writing it, it was not intentional, but I myself am neurodivergent, and I put a lot of myself into Jane. And then once I noticed that I had done that, I decided to play it up a little bit more and enhance it. So Jane is written as autistic, on the autism spectrum, just like me, with a couple different manifestations. And it has been really exciting to see people pick up on that, because it was a thing I was both nervous about and wasn't even sure would, on the flip side, register for people.
Yeah, I actually definitely got that sense as well while I was reading, so I was excited to see that question in there. Okay, this one is a bit of a spoiler, so if you haven't finished the book, just mute and then I'll wave when it's done. So, did Jane actually die? And if so, how did she return to us, or did she return to us?
So the answer is yes, she did die. Chapter 0 is called Chapter 0 because her death, in effect, is reducing, is like a singularity, is a point where suddenly time ceases to exist for her because she's dead. But in the moment of her death, time ceases to exist, but also it exists all at once. it gets into that weird hybrid magical thing that she's been dealing with the whole book and trying to unravel. And so because time is happening all at once, she is able to do the things that she does in chapter 0 in order to sort of, from a science fiction angle, fix the timeline because she started causing some paradoxes with her magic. And then at the end of that chapter, she supposedly, or she intends to complete her death, like sort of release that moment in time and have her consciousness disperse. However, something in the ritual that she did in order to free Lindridge Hall from its haunting, and also secondarily, as she figured out in chapter 0, make it so Augustine was actually alive, also brought her back. Augustine knows for a fact that she died. He had his hands inside of her body when her heart stopped. He knows that she died. She knows that she died. Neither of them knows exactly how she came back. But my hope with that little tiny chapter after chapter 0 before her actual recovery chapter, they both decide not to really question it because it's all done. And maybe it didn't happen the way they thought. And maybe magic isn't real and they both got really lucky and something weird just really happened. But yes, Jane did die.
All right, spoilers are over, so you can come back. Lauren asked that Nizamiev seemed at times the most threatening character in the novel. Can you speak a little to her character, her motivations, and what part she plays?
I love her so much. She is my favorite character. For those of you who haven't taken a peek at the back of the exclusive Barnes & Noble edition, you should, because there's an entire 9 pages of Abducha's notes on Jane, which has grants a little bit of insight into her character, what exactly she was up to. She is a character that's existed for a long time in the back of my brain, and I never knew what project I was going to use her for until this came along. And Abducha is, above all, very curious about what makes a person, and what the limits of humanity are and what the limits of the human mind are. And that's been true of every time I've tried to stick her in a setting. In this particular setting, as she says, researching magic is her personal interest. Her professional one, for those who haven't gotten that far in the book yet, is she runs an asylum in the city. And there is a fair amount of overlap between the two. As Abducha refers to magic as a particularly focused kind of madness at one point. And her interest in Jane and in Augustine and in everything that's going on is sort of up. She can see that the ingredients needed for something to happen are there. She recognizes in Jane, and she knows Augustine has done something magically that is undeniable. And that's very rare. So she's already interested in Augustine. Augustine doesn't want to do anything else. He's right. He's done. He has reached the limits of what he's comfortable exploring. Jane has all of the makings, meanwhile, to do even more than Augustine. And Abducha is curious to see what would happen if that were encouraged. So she takes a tack in the book of, she never tells Jane to do anything, but she certainly makes the resources available, and she provides encouragement in a way that is perhaps specifically calculated to intrigue Jane herself. So there's more to it than that I am holding in reserve in case I do get to write that theoretical second book. She would feature in it quite prominently. But yeah, for now, that and the bits you can glean from her notes in the back of the book. That's her.
The more I hear you say about this hypothetical second book, the more I want it to happen. So like if any of these people from Caitlin's publisher are watching this event, please know you have at least one buyer here because I'm dying to read more about Nizamiev. Okay, let's see. Somebody said, and your answer might get into spoilers, but the question is not inherently spoilery, so you can just let us know, Caitlin, if it's headed that way. Was Jane destined to do what she did to Augustine at the end because of her need to control the situation?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Basically, yes.
That is very simple. I like it.
There is again, this is the part where my editor was like, that's horrific. And I went, she meant, well, I thought it was nice. I thought it was, okay, here's spoiler. I'm going to wave at the beginning and I'll wave at the end. Jane's view on things on this particular issue of bringing Augustine back to life is that by the time that she realizes what she did, to undo the spell would kill him again. And she is not willing to make that choice on her own. And there is no real way for her to get consent from Augustine. So she errs with, I'm going to make him fully alive. And then there's the bit where I think that we have problems, which is then Jane never tells him. She just goes, well, okay, it's done. It's fine. He doesn't know what happened. I never have to tell him. And that kind of backfired when Augustine tried that trick earlier in the book. So I'm not sure why Jane thinks it's a good idea. But there you have it. Okay.
Let's see. This is another spoilery question. So I'll wave when it's all over. So Linda Lee says she almost expected Elodie to take over Jane's body or at least share it. Did you ever consider this? Or what do you think would have happened if that had gone down?
I had not considered that, but for a long time, Elodie was Elodie in the draft. She was actually the ghost of Elodie. The actual explanation, of course, in the book is that it was Jane all along. Jane was essentially haunting herself using the form that she interpreted at the time as Elodie. But when it was still Elodie, yeah, there were some, I never had her like sort of taking the place of Jane or anything else, but at one point she did try and trap Jane in the house with her. And the thing that grows in Jane's stomach during the book was related to that. I honestly, though, see Elodie now and have for a long time as she's not, if it were her, she would still be pretty benign and not malevolent. Like she would have just been trapped there like all the others. Of course, ghosts aren't real. So there was really, Augustine's patients weren't actually in that house, but. All right, I think we can unspoiler wave now.
Oh yeah, spoilers are over. Okay, so just a reminder, we have time for a couple more questions. So if you have a question that we haven't gotten to, feel free to throw it in the Q&A box. But while we're waiting for that, Judy asked, what are like the main, in your mind, themes and motifs of the book?
Oh gosh, I would say marriage and how we approach, how we view ourselves and our spouses is a big theme in that. And, how we how marriages, even loving ones, can have struggles for control inside of them and struggles for how we define each other to the world. That and obsession, magical obsession in this case, but it's also an obsession for control and for being allowed to sort of luxuriate in the dark parts of your own nature. The practice of magic calls to a part of Jane that has rarely been supported or accessed, and she finds it very hard to disentangle herself from what is honestly a very neutral thing in and of itself, is her desire for knowledge and her desire for being able to influence the world around her. But it goes off the rails, I think, in a way that is both exciting and seductive and also deeply scary.
I love that. All right. Last question, and then I think unfortunately we'll be out of time. And this one is coming from Joyce, and that's, was the thing in her belly an actual child or the result of magic?
It was the result of magic, and it was actually a thing in real life, unfortunately, sorry for this, guys, called it's a type of teratoma. So it is essentially an ovum that has decided to go it on its own and develop as much as it can. They are essentially a form of non-malignant cancer. They often have hair and teeth and sometimes eyeballs in them. They are not independently living in any way. And they are one of the freakiest medical things I've ever heard of. Everything in the book medically, except for Mr. Renton's Kleinbottle bowel, is in fact based in reality. So the thing that happened to Mr. Etheridge is a thing called, oh gosh, I think it's Fibrosignificans progressiva, but I might have gotten some of that off. But it is an actual thing, although it mostly afflicts children, which Augustine calls out in the text itself. And unfortunately, what Abigail goes through is just an ectopic pregnancy, which can be very, very, very deadly. But yeah, it's a freaky teratoma so it has a medical explanation. The fact that it grew that fast is a little bit weird. And points to magical involvement, and it definitely had a magical role, but the actual ailment is a real ailment.
That is really creepy to learn about, and is going to make me read the book very differently now. Just thinking about how everything is real and has a non-fantastical origin. So thank you so much for talking with me about the book. Just so everyone remembers, The Death of Jane Lawrence is available at your local Barnes & Noble store. It's also available 24/7 on bn.com. So if you haven't read it yet, especially if you don't own it, you should get it. If you want to get it as a gift, like the end is upon us and supply chains are awful. And so just go ahead and buy that book now if you're going to give it for the holidays. And yeah, thank you so much, Caitlin. That was incredible. I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you for enabling me to talk about bits that I didn't get to talk about in other events over the past month. And I want to also give a big thank you to Barnes & Noble for making it their October book club pick so that I could be here talking to you all.
And if you want to buy Jane Lawrence, it is linked in the chat. Barnes & Noble has put that information in there, as well as information about the next event they're having for book club, the December book, or the November book, I guess, is Gary Steingart's Our Country Friends. Somebody asked about that. So yeah, all right. I guess that's it. Thank you so much.